Welcome to the Boxing Gossip channel. Please hit subscribe as you are new. Regular viewers will know that there's already a video up on the channel focusing on keys to victory, strategy and tactics for Chris Eubank Jr. ahead of his fight with George Groves at the end of next week. As promised in that video, I wanted to upload a second video really focused on the same themes but from a George Groves perspective. So the intention is that I'm going to cover that in this video. Now, the feedback I received on the first video was on the whole positive, so hoping that it's of interest to people and that people kind of like these keys to victory videos. As a very minimum, I guess at least they let us build a bit early for some of these big fights that are coming up on the horizon. So maybe it's something we'll roll out again for the likes of AJ, Klitschko, Dillian White versus Lucas Brown, etc, etc. Anyway, in that Chris Eubank Jr. video, I talked about a number of things, so I'm not going to recite them because the video's up on the channel. If you want to check it out, please do so. But in that Chris Eubank Jr. video, one consistent theme that came up was range, distance, range or distance, however you want to phrase it. And I speculated that I believe that is possibly the single most key factor in this fight. So a number of the points I'm going to make in this video continue on that theme. Then I'm going to make a few additional points about things I think George Groves needs to do in order to be successful. But in a nutshell, for me, Chris Eubank Jr. is an A-class fighter on the inside and a B-class fighter on the outside. Similarly, I believe George Groves is an A-class fighter on the outside and a B-class fighter on the inside. So my honest take on this fight is, if Eubank is able to close down the range on Groves, get up close and personal with George Groves, it's a Eubank fight. If Groves can keep the fight at range, keep Eubank off him, and can keep catching him from distance, then quite simply, it's a Groves fight. I don't believe either guy has the tools to deal with the other one if the other one's able to implement their game. I believe they're both fantastic fighters, but I believe that they've both got limitations. So I think that is the key, is that distance. So with that in mind, key number one for George Groves is to try and keep range without expending too much energy. I talked about this in the Eubank side of the video. Chris Eubank Jr. has a tendency to have a look at opponents and to, box from range, try and get his jab moving, try to keep it long and try to move for the first few rounds of a fight before he settles in and tries to take the fight to the inside. George Groves needs to make the most of that, because the only time we've ever seen Eubank Jr. fighting at the world-class level before, he gave up too many early rounds in the first half of the fight, and it probably ended up costing him against Billy Joe Saunders. Groves needs to be mindful that that's a mistake Eubank's made in the past, and mindful that that could potentially be a mistake Eubank makes again. And if Chris Eubank Jr. wants to stand off George Groves, have a bit of a look at him and exchange jabs for the first few rounds, George Groves should accept that willingly with open arms and should try and steal 2 or 3 rounds without expending too much energy. And that is the key, the energy. George Groves is a fighter with a real tendency to tire and to weaken throughout the course of the fights. We've seen that in the Carl Froch fights, especially the first Carl Froch fight where he was well up and then weakened out of the fight. We've also seen it in the Martin Murray fight, another example where again George Groves was absolutely well up, he was comfortable, he was winning by a very, very clear margin, and Martin Murray has come back into the fight strong in the second half and almost caused George Groves a few problems late. So I think George Groves needs to be extremely mindful of not needlessly wasting energy in the first half of the fight. And if Eubank Jr. is content just to stand off him and to jab with him, George Groves should replicate that and do exactly that back and just accept that he's going to get a few rounds gifted to him rather than necessarily trying to look to take Eubank Jr. out. Point number 2 is related, but it kind of factors in ego, temper, attitude, etc. Recently we've seen George Groves go to war with the likes of Fedor Chudinov and Jamie Cox. Both times he's been successful and both times he's found the punch and he's had the power to extinguish the threat from those guys and win the fights by stoppage. But I believe, had he failed to stop either of those guys, he would have been in a very bad position in both of those fights, because I believe he risked punching himself out with the exchanges and with the style of fighting he had employed up to that point in the fight. You know, he'd been absolutely sucked into wars with the likes of Jamie Cox, Chudinov, etc., and we saw him really trading hell for leather. Now, Eubank is a guy who is untested in terms of his punch resistance against a guy as big and as powerful as George Groves. We have reason to suspect Eubank has a good chin and is very, very durable, but it's not proven at this level. I think Groves should be wary about looking to unload his gun against Eubank too early on in this fight. I think he would be better served to try and keep his energy stocks reserved. So I don't want to see George Groves throwing 10 power punch combinations in rounds 3 or 4. I don't want to see George Groves running around the ring using a huge amount of lateral movement if he doesn't need to. If Eubank is intent to stand in front of him and throw out a little jab, I want to see George Groves keep his reins but not be circling around the ring, and I want to see him just tapping with his jab, just scoring points, just outclassing Eubank from the outside. What I don't want to see him doing is throwing haymakers and running around the ring like Usain Bolt, because I believe that could lead George Groves to really empty his gas tank early on. And if he doesn't stop Eubank like he stopped Groves or Chudinov, and you suspect that Eubank is not going to be that easy a job, then we know Eubank can fight for 12 rounds. We know he's going to be coming on very, very strong in the later half of the fight, throwing lots of leather, and we know George Groves has a tendency you know, to run out of gas. I've seen Ultratech Sports discuss similar things on his channel before, and he's described George Groves very accurately as an extremely explosive fighter. You know, everything with George Groves is energy, it's explosion. You know, every punch is like a you know, thrown with the intent to take someone out. Every bit of movement is like fast lightning, you know, fast twitch fibers, etc. Maybe if he gets the chance in the first half of the fight just to you know, stand off and box, maybe he should do that, and you know, maybe that will really play into his advantages. So I guess that's my take there. Distance, using that jab early on, and yeah, not getting sucked into a war, not using up energy needlessly. Keeping your punches straight, and this is something George Groves is very good at to begin with. Eubank is a guy with a tendency to throw wide punches, looping hooks, looping uppercuts. You know, sometimes he's been known as an inaccurate puncher. Sometimes he leaves himself very exposed defensively when he's throwing such punches. Groves can take advantage of that by throwing straight punches, which is something he's very good at. He needs to get his jab pumping from round 1, and he needs to judge Eubank's timing and pace and range with it. What I'm expecting to see is Eubank looking to rush George Groves, charge in on him and make him uncomfortable in the middle rounds. And what I want to see is George Groves throwing that jab, catching Eubank, having enough behind it to keep Eubank off him, and then pivoting out of range. Think, if you will, of Billy Joe Saunders against David Lemieux. You know, I think that's what you want to see him doing. You want to see him throwing that jab, having enough on it to keep his opponent off him, and then pivoting out of the way. So if Eubank keeps charging forward at George Groves, Groves is not there. You know, that's when you want to start seeing the lateral movement. But you want to see Groves jabbing, timing, catching Eubank coming in, and throwing punches straight down the middle, fast and accurate, as potentially Eubank is coming in a bit more wide and wild than George Groves likes to. I don't want to see George Groves at any point in this fight, from a Groves perspective, with his back to the ropes. I believe that's when he's going to be at his most vulnerable against a guy like Chris Eubank Jr. If he has to go onto the inside with Jr., if Jr. Is so relentless that he gets through, firstly, I believe that's a bad look for Groves, but if that is the eventuality that occurs, I would prefer to see Groves doing that in the centre of the ring without his back to the ropes, so that he can try and wheel out and create distance again. I would also say Groves needs to be very, very wary and mindful of that uppercut. That uppercut from Eubank is Eubank's grade A weapon. It's the weapon that has been the most memorable of many Eubank Jr. fights. It's going to be an extremely eye-catching shot from a judging perspective, and it's a hurtful, spiteful punch. So I think Groves needs to be extra careful of that, especially if he's in mid to close range. One thing that I'd recommend that he does is maybe rewatch some of the footage from like a Klitschko versus Povetkin, you know, and try and look at the success Klitschko had closing down Povetkin in that fight. Now, people don't like the style that Klitschko employed. They describe it as jab and grab. They describe it as boring. They describe it as unsportsmanlike, a bad look for boxing, however you want to phrase it. But the truth of the matter is that Klitschko is not an inside fighter, and he was able to nullify the success on the inside of a guy like Povetkin. I think George Groves is similar to Klitschko in the sense that he's at his best when he has a jab, when he has distance, and he's not half the fighter he is from range as he is up close on the inside. So I really think George Groves needs to work on making sure he doesn't get into that inside fight with Eubank. Whilst he's not an inside fighter, he is a hot-headed guy. He does believe he's the bigger puncher. He does believe he's the bigger man. And there may be an element of ego that makes him get into that war if Eubank's able to close down the gap. I think he wants to look at Klitschko. I think he wants to look down, look at closing down the offence of Eubank rather than getting sucked in. I'd prefer it from a Groves perspective if he could nullify and then move out. He's got to be mindful of that uppercut on the inside. If they are in a clinch, I'd like to see Groves place his chin over Eubank's shoulder. You know, if they're leaning up against each other, tuck your chin in on his shoulder. It's going to be much harder for Eubank to land that uppercut on that chin if you know, if Groves tucks it in, and if Groves even uses Eubank's frame and uses Eubank's body as a shield in that clinch. What you don't want to see is Groves wrestling with Eubank, trying to impose his physical strength on Eubank and just standing upright with his chin in the air, because Eubank finds a home for that uppercut and he looks to throw it whenever he can. You know, we know this by now. That is you know, really proven from Eubank. So yeah, I think Groves needs to be very mindful of that uppercut. I think he needs to be very mindful of Eubank's success on the inside. And I think Groves needs to kind of accept that he isn't the inside fighter of Eubank. I'm a bit worried that ego and power and size will make Groves think that if the fight gets to the inside, he should tangle with Eubank. After all, he's fought smaller guys before, like Groves, like Chudinov and like Cox, and he's come out victorious by stoppage. So I'm a bit worried we'll see George Groves succumb to that sort of scrap. I'd prefer to see him acknowledge that Eubank is possibly the stronger fighter on the inside, and I'd prefer to see Groves look to nullify, protect, defend, and try and establish range again. The jab is key. Timing Eubank on the way in is key. Straight punches are going to be key against a guy who can at times be swinging from the fences a little bit, and you've got to be mindful of where Eubank's in his element. If you keep Eubank off you, for me, he's uncomfortable. For me, lesser fighters than George Groves have caused him real issues from range. But if you allow Eubank to get into his groove and to get into what he does very best, he really becomes a world-class fighter. And he becomes a world-class fighter in the areas where George Groves is at his very weakest. The jab is so key. If Eubank can get inside that jab and sit on George Groves from the early rounds, I think Eubank makes George Groves wilt. If Groves keeps Eubank off him, if he's able to conserve his energy, pump that jab out, keep him at distance, it's a frustrating night for Eubank and one that plays into Groves' strengths. Anyway, there we are, guys. That's my thoughts on the strategy and tactics from George Groves. Few keys to victory from a Groves perspective there from my side. Let me know your thoughts on the content. What is your take on the comments that I've made? Give us your thoughts in the comment section below. There will be a prediction video on this fight, of course, in the upcoming next few days. We'll be discussing the fight further and making a final pick. So if you'd be interested to see that, please hit the subscribe button, and if you haven't already done so, please click thumbs up, which means this channel and this video will get a little bit more visibility. As always, appreciate you guys tuning in.